We may have thought after the transcendental deduction that we had solved the problem of the application of, on the one hand, the concepts of the understanding, to, on the other hand, what is given in intuition, right? The sensible manifold. But Kant doesn't think we have fully solved that problem. We have shown, we have proved in the transcendental deduction that the categories apply to all objects of experience. That is true. But there is still a puzzle left. The puzzle is how they could possibly do that. And in a sense, the answer is that they couldn't possibly do that, and we need to add something to the critical system in order to make it a possibility. So that is what the Schematism chapter is in part going to do, and then in its other part it is going to sort of lay down the basic ideas that will be developed in the second chapter of the Analytical Principles. So let's see what Kant says. Let's look at what Kant says in the beginning of this chapter. He writes, in all subsumption of an object under a concept, the representations of the former must be homogeneous with the latter. That is, the concept must contain that which is represented in the object that is to be subsumed under it, for that is just what is meant by the expression an object is contained under a concept. Kant gives the example of a plate and the concept of a circle, right? I mean, in the concept of a circle, you have something that we can then recognize in a plate, right? And that's why we can say that this plate is a circle or this plate is circular. And quite in general, I mean, the concept must contain something that we can then recognize in whatever object we judge to fall under the concept. In fact, this recognition and the judgment are in a sense the same thing. Now, pure concepts of the understanding, however, in comparison with empirical, indeed in general sensible intuitions, are entirely unhomogeneous and can never be encountered in any intuition. And so Kant asks us whether, if that's the case, how we can apply the categories to anything that is given to us in sensation, anything that can be encountered in an intuition. Now, one way to think about this is to think, okay, so maybe Kant believes that the categories are too abstract, right? We have a category like cause and effect, or like substance. Well, how are we going to see that in the world, or recognize that in the world around us? But, you know, maybe they are pretty abstract empirical concepts as well. I think the best way to understand Kant's worry is to realize that for Kant, the 12 categories that we have found out about in the metaphysical deduction, the 12 categories are completely independent of the particular type of sensibility that we have. Right? We have space and time as the forms of our sensibility. Other rational beings might have other forms of sensibility, which are not space and time, but they would still have, if their understanding works the same way as ours, they would still have the same 12 categories. Right? They would still have the same 12 categories. So those 12 categories must be entirely unhomogeneous with space and time, the forms of our intuition, because they are entirely independent of it, and ought to be able to be applied also to completely different forms of intuition that we cannot even imagine. And that's a problem, because if these things, these categories, have nothing spatio-temporal about them, and if anything that's given in intuition is, you know, sort of necessarily given within this a priori framework of spatio-temporality, how does the application of one on the other works? Right? It seems as if we would need a special version of the categories. Right? We would like to have something which are the categories, but as they are to be applied to spatio-temporal intuition. Right? We need to say something about this bridge. Well, that is what Kant is going to call a transcendental schema. So let's listen to Kant. This is A 138 B 177. He says, now it is clear that there must be a third thing, which must stand in homogeneity with the category on the one hand and the appearance on the other, and makes possible the application of the former to the latter. This mediating representation must be pure, without anything empirical, and yet intellectual on the one hand, and sensible on the other. Such a representation is the transcendental schema. So this is just the thing that we need, right? We need something that somehow is the category, but also has the right form for it to be applied to our kind of intuition. What could that possibly be? Well, time is the form of all our intuition. And so what Kant is going to say is this. He says a transcendental time determination is homogeneous with the category, which constitutes its unity, insofar as it is universal and rests on a rule a priori. But it is, on the other hand, homogeneous with the appearance, insofar as time is contained in every empirical representation of the manifold. Hence, an application of the category to appearances becomes possible by means of the transcendental time determination, which, as the schema of the concept of the understanding, mediates the subsumption of the latter under the former. So, basically what Kant is going to do is he is going to say this. Okay, on the one hand we have the categories, but those categories, our minds, in fact, as we will see in a minute, our imagination, is going to schematize the categories. It produces schematized forms of the categories, which on the one hand embody the categorical concept, right? This rule. It is a rule. It is a rule that is linked to, that is clearly the embodiment of this category. But it is a rule about time determination. It is a rule about how time is constituted or how things in time are constituted. On the other hand, right? So it's a rule, but not the kind of rule that is independent of sensibility, that is the category in itself, the unschematized category. No, the schematized category is a rule about time, or the representation of things in time, the representation of objects in time. That's what the schema is. That's what the schematism is. Okay, so I want to look at that in a little more detail, but I do want to take this little opportunity to just point you at one of these moments where I think that that Kant's use of his own terminology might put us on the wrong footing, because I think there's an absolutely clear example of that here. So at B178, A139, just after what I've been reading out, Kant says, after what has been shown in the deduction of the categories, hopefully no one will be in doubt about how to decide the question whether these pure concepts of the understanding are of merely empirical or also of transcendental use. That is, whether as conditions of a possible experience they relate a priori solely to appearances, or whether as conditions of the possibility of things in general they can be extended to objects in themselves. Now it's clear what Kant wants to answer that, right? I mean, what we have seen in the deduction, we know that these pure concepts of the understanding are of merely empirical use. They only apply to appearances and not to things in themselves. So what Kant, I think, should have written is that they are of merely empirical and not of transcendent use, right? We cannot use them to transcend our experience or the world of appearances. But transcendental is officially Kant's word for his own, for the kind of philosophy that we're doing here, the kind of philosophy that tries to think through the conditions of all objective experience. And clearly the pure concept of the understanding are extremely useful. In fact, they have like an absolutely central place in transcendental philosophy. And so it is so misleading to say that they have no transcendental use, when what is actually meant is that they don't have a transcendent use, right? I just wanted to point that out as a thing that you have to be wary of sometimes, especially with this transcendental pair. Okay. So Kant tells us a little bit more about the schema, or its plural, the schemata, or its use, the schematism. He tells us that they are a product of the imagination, which shouldn't surprise us, because the imagination we saw in the transcendental deduction is basically where conceptual thinking and our forms of sensibility, our intuition, sort of come together. It is the sort of place where the one is being applied to the other. And he tells us something about how these things are like rules rather than like images. They're sort of like rules for constructing images, much more than images themselves. So the schema of a number is a sort of way, a method or a rule for thinking up particular numbers and conceiving of particular numbers. It's not the picture of a particular number. The schema of a triangle is a sort of particular rule for generating triangles. It is not a particular picture of a triangle. And so Kant says, and this is B180, the end of A140, in fact it is not images of objects but schemata that ground our pure sensible concepts. No image of a triangle, he goes on, would ever be adequate to the concept of it, for it would not attain the generality of the concept, which makes this valid for all triangles, blah blah blah, but would always be limited to one part of this sphere. Here really is Kant's intervention into the debate that exercised like Locke and Berkeley and Hume so much, the debate about abstract ideas, right? Where Locke sort of suggests that we have an abstract idea of a triangle, which is kind of a picture. It's got to be something like a picture, given like the underlying ideas of Locke. But it's also supposed to stand in for any triangle. And this is then criticized by Berkeley, who says, well, that's impossible, right? And so Berkeley tries to do away with abstract ideas. And there's just always the particular idea, and Hume sort of builds on Berkeley's ideas. And Kant is here, I mean, he's rejecting the empiricist strictures, of course, the empiricist framework in which all these philosophers are working. And he says, you know, any thinking about this in terms of images doesn't work. You've got to think of it in terms of a rule. You've got to think of it in terms of a rule for creating images. You've got to think of this in terms of a schema. That is really what is doing the work. So this is where Kant sort of tells the British, at least in one little debate, where the British empiricists went wrong, according to him. Okay, so now what Kant is going to do is he is going to sort of concretely enumerate what these schema are. And he doesn't do a lot of explanation of them, he just sort of mentions them, and he's going to do much more explanation of them in the much longer second chapter of the Analytic of Principles. So here is what we have. Okay, we had these four sets of three categories, and what we will see is that the first two sets, Kant sort of brings them together, right? He's just going to talk about quantity and quality, and he's not going to say, especially about quantity, he's not going to sort of say so much about all the three different categories falling under them. He is going to do that for the other ones. We will also see in the second chapter that he is pretty quick about the first two sets of categories, and then is going to take his sweet time talking especially about the third set, and also about the fourth set. So we have the pure schema of magnitude is number, right? So the basic idea of quantity is number, and okay, we're going to look at this more in what follows. But here's what Kant says about it now, which is a representation that summarizes the successive addition of one homogeneous unit to another. Right. So when we think of something like a quantity of time, because Kant wants us to think about time, right? If I think of a quantity of time, I'm thinking of all these little elements of time added together. Maybe I'm even thinking of it under the image of a line, as Kant suggests, like drawing it in space. I'm thinking of all these little homogeneous units brought together, and that's a quantity. So at the end of this paragraph, or well, later on in this paragraph, this is B184, A145, Kant will tell us that what is constituted really here is the time series, right? It's the idea of all these elements of time forming a line. Okay, so that is quantity. Quality, or reality, is in the pure concept of the understanding that to which a sensation in general corresponds, that therefore the concept of which in itself indicates a being in time. And so Kant's basic idea here is that reality is like when something appears in time, when there's something there, when there is sensation. And under this second set of categories, Kant is going to talk about perception and sensation, and the things that appear to us, like as pure sensory qualities, something like red or painful or cold or that kind of stuff, right? It appears in time. This is the time not being empty, but there being something real in time. Or, as Kant says it in this little passage later on, the content of time. Then, in more detail, or at least, splitting them out into three elements, we get the categories of relation. The schema of substance is the persistence of the real in time. So the basic idea of a substance is something that continues to exist in time. And again, here we have sort of this abstract idea of substance, which is just like a subject that can have properties. But now it becomes something temporal, right? The schematized version is the continued existence, the persistence of something through time. That is what the idea of substance is going to amount to. The schema of the cause and of causality of a thing in general is the real upon which, whenever it is posited, something else always follows. It therefore consists in the succession of the manifold insofar as it is subject to a rule. Right? So this causation, which is in itself just the idea of ground and consequent, super abstract, here it becomes temporalized. It's here of something upon which something else must follow in time. Right? That is the schema of cause and effect. The schema of community, or of the reciprocal causality of substances with regard to their accidents, is the simultaneity of the determinations of the one with those of the other in accordance with a general rule. We will hear more about this later too, but here Kant's basic idea is that community, or sort of interaction, what that comes down to is being at the same time. Right? There can only be community interaction if things are in existence at the same time. That's the schematized version of the concept, the category of community. What about the modal categories, possibility, actuality, or necessity? The schema of possibility is the agreement of the synthesis of various representations with the conditions of time in general. Thus the determination of the representation of a thing to some time. Basically, the way I'm reading this here is that it is the idea that something fits the conditions set up by time. Right? It can be placed in time. Something is possible if it could be at some time. The schema of actuality is existence at a determinate time. It's there. The schema of necessity is the existence of an object at all times. That's actually Aristotle's definition of necessity, I believe. Something is necessary if it exists at all times. And that may sound a bit weird because, well, maybe something could exist at all times even though it's not necessary, right? Even though it's not a necessary being. But we're going to hear more about that when we get to the appropriate part of chapter 2. Okay, so finally what Kant tells us is that, like sort of summarizing this and explaining how all of this fits together with the idea of time. Now one sees from all this that the schema of each category contains and makes representable, in the case of magnitude, the generation or synthesis of time itself in the successive apprehension of an object. Right? Magnitude is about, oh, there's all these little homogeneous elements and we bring them together and it becomes more and more and more. This is the idea of time itself. In the case of the schema of quality, the synthesis of sensation with the representation of time or the filling of time. So this abstract empty time is filled up with sensation. There's something real there, right? It has content. In the case of the schema of relation, the relation of the perceptions among themselves to all time, that is in accordance with a rule of time determination. It is like how these contents of time relate to each other within this whole of time, right? It's that they're not these individual elements. They are related to the rest of what happens in time. That is what the schema of relation does. And finally, in the schema of modality and its categories, time itself as the correlate of the determination of whether and how an object belongs to time. Time itself sort of understood as the condition of, well, whether something is real, whether it exists, whether it's necessary, possible. The schemata are therefore nothing other but a priori time determinations in accordance with rules, and these concern, according to the order of the categories, the time series, like this, the line of time, the content of time, what's there, the order of time, how the things are ordered in time, right? Which ones come first and which ones come later. We are going to see this in detail when Kant talks about causation. And finally, the sum total of time in regard to all possible objects. Okay, so that is the schematism, and I hope that the basic idea is clear. What might be less clear is whether this is successful. I mean, Kant sets up this big problem, right? There is the concept and there is the intuitive manifold, and they have to be brought together. And so Kant gives us these schematized versions, which is nice and which is going to help us moving forward, because now we understand how the categories could be applied to things in time. But how did we get from one to the other? Right? How did we get from the categories to, well, I mean, Kant has tried to explain that, but he also says in maybe one of the more infamous sentences of the book, and this is at A141, and it's where B180 turns into B181. He says, the schematism of our understanding with regard to appearances and their mere form is a hidden art in the depths of the human soul, whose true operations we can divine from nature and lay unveiled before our eyes only with difficulty. Some people have thought that the schematism is hard to understand, that this is one of the points where Kant has to sort of, in this sentence, kind of throw up his hands in the air and say, well, you know, this is just how it works. I'm not sure. I mean, if the schematized versions of the categories make sense of the categories within the context of time, and if we can see that, yeah, in order to sort of understand and experience things in time, these are precisely the things that we need, these are precisely the temporal concepts that we need, I don't know, that might be enough for Kant to have done the job well. So I'm not particularly worried about the schematism, but there's definitely a literature trying to define whether it's even necessary, and if it's necessary, whether it could possibly succeed. So that's something you might want to be aware of. Okay, having done that, we are going to move on to the second chapter, which is the system of all principles of pure understanding.